Welcome everyone to the COSP 16 virtual side event hosted by the Canadian Centre on Disability Studies Incorporated, operating as Eviance. This panel presentation is entitled Realizing Human Rights and Social Justice in Mental Health and International Collaboration. My name is Susan Hardy, the Eviance Executive Director, and I will serve as a moderator for this panel. I am a woman who is white with short blonde hair, wearing a floral rose lace jacket that is black, whom identifies as she, her. Next slide. We would like to begin this panel with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that New York City is located in ancestral Lenape homelands, and we recognize the long-standing significance of these lands for Lenape nations, past and present. We are conscious that New York City has the largest urban Indigenous populations in the United States. As we come from different lands, we invite you to take a moment and reflect silently upon your lands you live, work, and play. Thank you for taking that moment. And I will now turn this over to Amin from Eviance, who will walk us through the technology involved in this virtual presentation. Amin?
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Amin. So we have real-time captioning and international sign language available throughout the session. The link to download the accessible version of the presentation is available at the bottom right section titled as Resources. If you have any questions during the session, please drop them at Q&A section, and these will be answered at the end of the session. To get live captioning in the language of your choice, please click up arrow next to the caption button and select your language. If you're not able to observe the caption option, click 3 dots or more, then click captions and select your language. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amin. I'd now like to just look at the overview of the panel for today. As mentioned, I'll be the moderator and provide an introduction and also closing remarks. The first pairing, I have a bit of feedback here. The first pairing will be Marina Monroe from York University and Garvi Davar from TCI. The second pairing will be Victor Lizama and Lorenza Bello. And I will leave it to both of them to introduce their organizations when they present, so that I don't inappropriately, I didn't think I could do justice to their organization in Spanish. Next slide. Before going out through the objectives, the 3 objectives for this panel, I'd like to give you a story behind the presentation. And the last time I was able to physically attend the COSP meetings in person, I had an informal discussion with the CRPD committee chairperson at the time. And they let me know that they wanted to see more meaningful involvement of persons with psychosocial disabilities in future COSP meetings. This stuck with me, as unknown to the chair, that myself and others have been trying to overcome the financial barriers and accommodation issues to participate. This panel is one of what we hope may be more presentations addressing how people with psychosocial disabilities have been left behind and not supported equitably by cross-disability and justice movements, more broadly in ensuring that all persons with disabilities can be rights holders as outlined in the CRPD. A key saying for me is Inclusion, not exclusion, is the basis of a civilized society. Now let's turn our attention to the panel objectives. The first objective being to foreground the lived experiences, and I will emphasize the collective lived experiences of people with psychosocial disabilities who have experienced involuntary treatment. The second objective is to bring people together in shared international dialogue about the human rights of people with psychosocial disabilities. And the third objective is to discuss the challenges and achievements of trying to harmonize national policies related to psychosocial disabilities with the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and the United Nations Convention and other United Nations conventions. Next slide. Oh, sorry. And now I will turn this over to Marina Morrow, and she will be joined by Harvey and discuss the first presentation.
Thank you so much, Susan, for the introduction, and welcome to everyone. My name is Marina Morrow, and I'm a professor at York University in Toronto, Canada. I'm a white woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, and I'm wearing a green short-sleeve shirt. And I'm here in New York City visiting, as I said, from Toronto, Canada. And I just wanted to start by acknowledging my gratefulness for being able to live and work in the area known as Toronto, which has historically been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron, and the Wendat. And I acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'm grateful to be here today on the homeland of the Lenape. In my presentation today, I'm going to be introducing you to an international project that involves Canada, Kenya, and Australia called Realizing Human Rights and Social Justice in Mental Health. And it's funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. I'm going to focus today on the preliminary findings at the Canadian site, since our Kenyan and Australian colleagues are not with us today. I then will turn things over to Bhargavi Devar to discuss TCI Global and their work in relation to our project, and more broadly on building a global movement. The project itself is focused on documenting the lived experiences of coercive practices and human rights violations in mental health, and the role of recovery-oriented, community-driven practices in advancing equity. I want to begin by acknowledging the larger research team and the partnerships. As I mentioned, this is an international multi-site project, Canada, Australia, and Kenya. And in each locale, we have an academic working collaboratively with a community partner who represents a disability rights activist organization. So in the case of Canada, it's Aviance, or the Canadian Centre for Disability Studies. In Kenya, it's the User Survivor Network and PDO Kenya. And in Australia, it's VIMIAC. We also have many research assistants drawn from the university, but also from community organizations. It's important to note that we have people with lived experience of psychiatry and mental health care throughout all levels of our project, and that we chose Canada, Kenya, and Australia as our sites because they're all Commonwealth countries. They all have distinct experiences of colonization, and they're all under the same or similar legislative frameworks with respect to the Mental Health Act. We also are guided by an international network of people working in human rights, social justice, and mental health that work with us to support the research and ongoing knowledge mobilization activities. And some are with us today, and you'll get a chance to meet Bhargavi in this presentation. So the rationale behind this research comes from the recognition that despite the movement towards deinstitutionalization in mental health and the move towards recovery models that promised a more humane form of mental health care in line with human rights, that coercive practices and human rights violations in mental health care continue. Here I'm speaking about things like involuntary detainment and treatment, the use of restraints and seclusion, as well as other discriminatory practices. These practices have in many jurisdictions become routine and are experienced by people as traumatizing, violent, and coercive. And they're mediated through day-to-day stigmatizing attitudes and discriminatory behaviors, as well as through state-sanctioned practices like the Mental Health Act. We know, of course, that discrimination doesn't affect everyone equally. So the intersections of gender, racialization, citizenship, and colonization intersect with mental distress, and thus certain populations are more likely to be impacted by coercive practices and mental health human rights violations. Just to give an example, in the Canadian context, we know that Black and Indigenous and people of color, as well as people with addictions, are more likely to be subject to coercive practices. In fact, a recent report from one of our largest Canadian mental health teaching hospital, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, reported that Black men are more likely than other men or women to be put in restraints. This is the case after almost 20 years after the death of a Black man in the care of that institution. His name was Jeffrey James, who died after being in restraints for 5 days. We also know that abuse of Indigenous people in the healthcare system is common, and there's been a recent report by Terpel Lafond in BC documenting the abuses, and the name of that report is called In Plain Sight. So we also know that Canada, Kenya, and Australia are all signatories to UN conventions that are meant to protect rights. So the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and in the case of Canada and Australia, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we also know that internationally, there are many non-governmental and disability persons organizations that are survivor-led that play a key advocacy role in mental health, and that we do have excellent community-based models for recovery-oriented, non-coercive care. Because I'm speaking today primarily in the Canadian context, or the Canadian results of our project, I wanted to give just some brief context for the discussion today. So I want to tell you just a little bit about the Mental Health Act. So the Mental Health Act is a provincial territorial law, which means that it varies in terms of how it's enacted between province and territory. The two sites in our study are Ontario and BC. In Ontario, detainment and forced treatment require two different legal processes. But in BC, it's the only province that has something called deemed consent, which means that once a person is detained, they're deemed to have consented to all treatments which follow. Depending on the jurisdiction that a person is detained in, they can be detained if they are, quote, a danger to themselves or others, or if, quote, they're deteriorating physically and mentally, and if treatment has, quote, worked in the past. Some jurisdictions are currently trying to open up the act to allow for the detainment and forced treatment of people, particularly youth with addictions, and this is true in British Columbia and Alberta. This is despite the fact that internationally, the move has been away from coercive practices, both at the level of the WHO, the UN. Canada has signed on to something called the Sydney Declaration. And there's been a movement, of course, towards shared decision-making models and the abolishment of restraints and seclusion. In the Canadian context, mental health care is very crisis-driven. People often cannot access supports until they're very unwell, and their first point of contact is often the police or emergency services. And the main form of support, in quotations, is actually psychotropic medications. Many people are thus sent back out into situations that have either caused or exacerbated their mental distress in the first place. So here I'm talking about being sent back out into poverty and homelessness. In the Canadian context, Canada ratified the UN CRPD in 2010 with reservations on Article 12, which is the article related to substitute decision-making. Canada did sign on to the optional protocol in 2018. So currently, really, Canada's domestic mental health laws are in contravention of the CRPD. Several reports have been produced to urge Canada to independently evaluate its mental health laws and engage in reforms that will align domestic law with international standards. So in Canada, we currently have no domestic mechanism related to the CRPD for psychosocial disability. So in many ways, we're forced to go to the UN. It's interesting to note that Danius Puras, the former special rapporteur on the right to health, who ended his term in 2020, noted the lack of parity between physical and mental health in Canada, and noted the extent of human rights violations against people with psychosocial disabilities. The Mental Health Commission of Canada, which is a federal body that provides education and does research, but also established the first national strategy in 2012, had 3 pilots to determine what is needed so that Canada can sign on to the entirety of the CRPD. This was headed by Chief Justice Ted Ormsted and the Mental Health and Law Committee. And of course, Inclusion Canada has done significant work on supported decision-making, and yet none of these recommendations to date have been taken up. So to turn to the project now, as I mentioned, the broad overarching goal was to investigate mental health service user experiences of coercive practices and the role of recovery-oriented organizations that involve people with lived experiences in advancing equity and social justice. The project has 3 phases. I won't go into these in a lot of details, but on a separate slide, I'll tell you a little bit about the methods. So phase 1 was a review of the literature and an environmental scan, and we did an intersectional-based policy analysis. We're currently in phase 2, which is doing focus groups with people with lived experience and doing key informant interviews with people who hold insider knowledge of mental health care systems. And phase 3 is going to be doing case studies to highlight exemplars of social justice and equity in mental health. It's important to note that in our project, we center something called intersectional values, and these also align, I think, with many of the types of values that guide MAD activism and the MAD movement. So intersectionality, of course, is a framework which understands oppression and privilege as intersecting and overlapping, and that those intersections and overlaps can tell us something about how power operates. So under this set of values, we have, as I mentioned, lived experiences at all levels of the research. We have an understanding of mental health that's informed by the social and structural determinants of health. We've adopted intersectional and human rights frameworks. We recognize the historical and ongoing impact of colonization, and we see community engagement as key to our work, and reflexivity, which is, of course, the practice of continually reflecting on our own social positioning and how that is impacting the research. So briefly, the methods on this project involved an intersectional-based policy analysis of domestic and national mental health policies. Intersectional-based policy analysis uses intersectionality as a theoretical framework to help us surface underlying values and assumptions of policies. We also did what's called a critical realist review of the literature and an environmental scan. And the reason for that was to try to surface human rights and equity promoting practices in mental health. And as mentioned, we're doing focus groups and key informant interviews. So to date in Canada, we have done 10 focus groups. In Kenya, we've done 4. Australia is just getting started with 2. And in each of the cities that we are doing the research in, Vancouver, Toronto, Nairobi, Nakuru, and Melbourne, we're doing at least 10 key informant interviews. So I'm going to turn now, as I mentioned, we're still, obviously, the project is ongoing. We're at different stages in different sites. So these are really just preliminary findings that I wanted to draw your attention to. So from the policy literature review and environmental scan, what we're seeing is that colonialism is baked into psychiatry historically and has an ongoing legacy. So it influences how people are diagnosed, how they're treated. In the Canadian context, the historical legacy of residential school system and the ongoing harms of colonization through the mental health system and the child welfare system are good examples. In policy, we're seeing that the language and the values that are held are all very shaped by biomedical dominance, which individualizes mental distress and shapes responses away from addressing social determinants. On the positive side, we're seeing that human rights and equity promoting practices that are community and user-driven, holistic, and person-centered in their approach and do not involve police are ones that are going to promote equity. With respect to the field research, we're seeing that force and coercion have become part of routine care in many instances in mental health, and that in the course of care, human rights are often not respected, and are state sanctioned through the Mental Health Act. Discrimination based on ability, and in this case, saneism, race, gender, gender identity, poverty, homelessness, and indigeneity shapes people's experiences in mental health care. And people who use mental health care, of course, want holistic care, compassionate care, rights and trauma-informed care, care that's non-discriminatory, and care that does not reinforce colonialism. So far, the takeaways from our project and the takeaways towards shifting the paradigm involve disrupting biomedical reductionism, protecting human rights in mental health, enhancing equity through social care. And some of the things that this will require include the adoption and values of principles that uphold human rights and equity in mental health by governments, policymakers, and service providers, support for the leadership of people with lived experience at policy development levels, tables, and in service delivery, the adoption of intersectional and decolonizing approaches in mental health, and that in Canada and in other jurisdictions, we need to act on reviews of the legislative requirements to align the Mental Health Act with the CRPD. And of course, we need transformative change with a shared vision that will come from engagement with community. And finally, just before I bring Bhargavi to the table, I just want to draw attention to the fact that we're working with our international partners to develop an international network for social justice and mental health. We've sponsored with our partners a webinar series, and we're holding lots of local community forums to present our preliminary findings and discuss strategies for change. And at the end of the presentation, you'll see a website where you can keep informed about our work. So I'm going to ask Bhargavi to come now and talk about building a global movement.
Thank you, Marina, for a very comprehensive presentation. My name is Bhargavi Davar, and I am presently Executive Director at Transforming Communities for Inclusion. It started out on this very fragile idea that when you talk about mental health, we face closed doors, big walls, cages, and so on and so forth. So what can we do to stop talking about mental health and yet talk about psychosocial disability? And so we called ourselves Transforming Communities for Inclusion. And when we were exposed to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we realized that with the CRPD and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, we were out there in meadows and plains and fields with many open doors and many kinds of opportunities. We met peers from the disability movement, from the women's movement, from other movements, and we felt we belonged there. And so we stuck to the name. Transforming Communities for Inclusion was initially a workshop idea, but it seemed to suit the name of a whole movement, which steps away, which sidesteps the problems of locating ourselves within mental health. So that's a bit about me. I'm presently, it's now a registered organization. We have members in 50 countries. We have good projects in about 20 countries. We are mobilizing. Mainly our job is to bring people into this discussion on identity. Do you identify as person of unsound mind? Do you identify as a lunatic? I'm sorry, but these are words which still exist in the vocabulary of the global South legal systems. Do you identify as a patient? Do you identify as a bipolar, schizophrenic? Do you identify as a person with psychosocial disability, and so on and so forth? So we talk a lot about identity positions, especially in the earlier stages. Now, we are a very diverse group of people who have fallen under the rubric of psychosocial disabilities. And it includes MAD activists, it includes users and survivors of psychiatry, persons who consider themselves neurodiverse and having intersectional identities, persons with psychosocial disability and indigenous identities, people who are deemed as unsound mind by the legal systems. So it's autistic persons, persons with learning disabilities. So it's really a wide range of diverse people with diverse experiences who populate the movement. The importance of I would like to talk a little bit about being exposed to trainings on the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities almost right after its adoption way back in 2010. And a lot of us in the Asia Pacific regions, Latin America, Africa, we had the good fortune of receiving trainings on the CRPD. And so our internationalism, exposure to the UN human rights mechanisms, our understanding of national policy and how to intervene, it started very early on. The challenge, of course, in many parts of the world, even today, is that there aren't organized organizations of persons with psychosocial disabilities still in many parts of the world. And so sometimes in these trainings, it was difficult to identify persons from our communities who could partake of the trainings. That situation is slowly changing. And I believe that TCI played a role in this, other than the International Disability Alliance through their Bridge program. And so we have been very lucky in the Global South to have very strong foundation on human rights values as given to us by the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This internationalism allowed us to search for people like us. Like in India, I think I was the sole identified survivor of psychiatry. At that time, I had a very strong identity as a survivor of psychiatry. And at this point, for me, somewhere in a remote part of India, to know that I'm a survivor of psychiatry, I have to acknowledge that there were several leaders, people who were leaders of the movement from before, and I can have a whole list of people there TCI, till today, we honor them, leaders and martyrs who gave their lives. Many of them left before their time, trying to deal with this impossible, hazardous, violent system of care. So we remember them, we honor them, and we stand on their memories. We stand on their work, and we will continue to do this and hope to see changes in the future so that no further lives are lost to this system. So we got a chance to travel, and our first stop was this, of course, the Asia Pacific region. And it was great that Marina presented the initial findings where colonialism is a big theme. Colonialism for me was an abstract concept until, of course, India. Living in India, I know that the railway system, for example, is highly colonial, but I never thought about it in the same way with respect to the Indian psychiatric system and its institutions. But once I started traveling through Nepal, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, some of these places, I started to understand that colonialism is a living entity within the mental health system in many parts of the world, but not in the same way. Mental health laws do not exist all over the world. They may soon exist all over the world because there are interlocutors of colonialism today who are really propelling the growth of mental health legislations. And they've been doing this for the last 50 years. From the 1970s onwards, the World Health Organization has been promoting mental health legislations, and they continue to do so. And so there is that, but many countries lacked mental health law. So it is not a universal fact that for a country to be modern in mental health care, they needed a mental health law. There were some countries, for example, Thailand, they brought in a mental health law and the number of institutions went up phenomenally. India amended its mental health law in 1987, and from about 40 institutions, I'm sure that we are at about 4,000 institutions, both private and public. With each modification of the mental health care, law in India, you have greater privatization, greater control handed over to the psychiatrists, easier admissions become, it's not a matter of constitutional right anymore. It's not about right to liberty anymore. It's about administrative procedures. How quickly can you put somebody away with just the doctor's, validation? And so these laws are very old. They are 200 years old. If you go to East Timor, the big beast of colonialism is just leaving the shores. It's as stark as that. Fiji Islands, the old institution is still there. Many parts of India, the old institutions are still what they were before. And reforming the law does not change its colonial content. I think this has been a finding. And certain countries which colonized had exercised far greater power over some populations than some other countries. Like, for example, Indonesia had a Dutch colonial system. It was not as, they didn't have this vast nexus of institutions. Philippines did not have this vast, they were colonized by the Spanish. They had one civil code, including the deaf, mute, and persons of unsound mind. But they didn't have this vast repertoire, legal repertoire, by which for one reason or the other, you can take somebody's liberty away and put them into one or the other institutions. The British, we had the pauper houses, the vagrant houses, we had the lepers houses, we had the criminal tribe houses, we had those accused of prison houses. Then, of course, we had the houses for the lunatics, people of unsound mind, and the idiots. Those systems remain. So this was very stark for us, and it also gave us a sense of relief and hope that, hey, what's happening in some countries is not what happens in all countries. If we want to implement the CRPD, India would be extremely difficult, but Nepal would be much easier. Philippines would be much easier. Indonesia would be much easier. Because you don't have to bring something down, which is so expensive, move those big budgets into community mental health programs. And so, it was much easier to do it in countries which had a different legal system than the ones that are existing in the Commonwealth. So I think so that we started on this footing. And how do you implement colonialism? It's an abstract concept. It's an academic concept. How do you bring it into advocacy? This was a big challenge because we could see that these things are going on, but who are the interlocutors? We had to identify who are the interlocutors of colonialism. Of course, it's the professional lobbies, the Global Mental Health Movement, the United for Global Mental Health Movement, and so on. So these were the interlocutors, the professional lobbies, the service provider lobbies, and also, of course, the World Health Organization. So it's been an extended conversation and dialogue with them. Right, it's been an extended dialogue with them. And then we started to see that as a Global South movement, we were joined in our experiences across Africa, Latin America, and Asia Pacific. But what about the Global North? Those issues, are they very different from ours? And how do we reach out to them? Because we drew from the movements of the user survivor movements of the Global North. And there was a yearning to connect back with that community and see whether we can establish dialogues. So we have been doing that. The difference is that in the Global South, the community, neighborhoods, families continue to play a crucial role in giving us support systems. There is an availability of social capital even today in many parts of the Global South, despite the harsh socioeconomic environments. But we do see the growth of mental health legislations in the Global South, particularly in Africa. The growth of mental institutions, the enforcement of legal capacity laws. Many of these legal capacity laws in many countries were dead laws. Nobody was using them so much. But with increased socioeconomic progress in some countries, then legal capacity laws tend to be used with vested interests. So there are those developments going on, which brings us closer and closer to the Global North experience. In another 5 years, we might actually have a stronger movement of people protesting their involuntary commitments, the way they were treated with inhuman, degrading treatments inside mental asylums, how their property was taken away by fraudulently applying incapacity laws, and so on and so forth. So we can wait for these to happen in the Global South. And so we are looking at an important strategy for us has been to look at identity transitioning of organizations. Many organizations which call themselves mental health organizations transitioned into OPDs, Organization of Persons with Psychosocial Disabilities, when we brought these kinds of considerations before them. And in the Global North as well, we are having transitioning groups who are working more and more closely with the disability movement and creating new political positioning of their identities. And what the broader identity of disability gives us is a vast canvas for interventions and a larger number of people who can be allies in our exchanges with this professional lobbies and the institution culture of mental health. So I think I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bhargavi. I just want to say that I've learned so much from our collaborations with you and from our international partners. So the conversation, particularly around colonialism and how to move forward with activism in each of these locations is going to be ongoing. We're going to transition to our next speakers. So I'm going to stop sharing and bring up some new slides for you.